Hello, and welcome to a bonus snippet episode of the Choral podcast. I'm Chris Muntz, and I've just been thinking about choral elitism lately and trying to do what I do, which is to think about it in my own unique way and to take the types of conversations that I've seen and been a part of over the course of the last several years on this topic and then just work them through my brain and see if I can come up with something new. And that's kind of what I've been thinking about lately on this topic of what does it mean to say that the choir world is elitist. I think so you might see that phrase happen multiple times and from multiple different people, and the problem is that it might mean something different every time a different person says it. What are they referring to specifically when they make that criticism? And I think sometimes we might assume that they're referring to the concept of what it means to be a good choir. Right, so let's say we have this idea of what qualifies, what counts as an excellent choir, and maybe that definition is held by a lot of people, and maybe it's reinforced by the university system, maybe it's reinforced by some parts of the world that do choir competitions, and who wins and who doesn't win, and that whole side of what we do. And I think that's fair. There's a fair criticism there that we do. Have some centered definitions of what it means to be a good choir. Now, on the flip side of that, you kind of have to. Like, we lose our entire profession if we throw the baby out with the bathwater and don't acknowledge the fact that there is such a thing as a good choir and that there are such a thing as better choirs than other choirs. You don't have to be elitist to acknowledge that. There are certain things that good choirs do that other choirs would strive to do. In fact, that's why this podcast exists. And ultimately, it's why people listen. It's why people tune in, is because they think that at some level that either the conversations are interesting and or they're going to find something helpful that they can bring into their classroom and improve their practice. Why? At some level, it's because they want their choir to be better. Why? Because when the choirs are better, humans have better experiences. And this was something that I learned actually when I was young from my mother, who was a very not elitist, very just small town elementary school music teacher in a town of 7,000 people. She was also the music director at our church. Okay, so I grew up in that. I was raised by a choir director my whole life. And one of the things that I learned early on was that if the music is out of tune, for example, just one of many, if the music is out of tune in worship, what my mom used to say was that would form a barrier between the congregation and God. And the reason she would say that was not because someone out in the congregation would sit there and go, wow, the choir's G major chord at that transition into G major from the E minor section was not quite well tempered or justly in tune. The congregation, the layperson's not going to think those things. We think those things because we're trained. But what she was pointing out, which I do find very insightful, was that a layperson might not know the terminology to describe the out-of-tune singing, but it is just enough distraction from what they would like to hear that when we are singing in a not good way, and I'll just use air quotes, and not good, when the singing is not good, it causes the listener to be distracted, whereas in a worship setting, they might just want to be transported to something that is transcendent. It's otherworldly. Or another way I could think to describe this would be like when you go to Disney World. If you've ever been to Disney World, one of the things that's cool about Disney World is they make you forget you're not in the real world. And if you've spent any amount of time there, I've been there several times, one of the things that's the most distracting is when one of the employees, they're always in costume and they're in character, right? But one of the employees leaves like a side door open where you can see maybe like an employee-only area where it's not decorated like Disney anymore, and maybe it's not as clean because they clean like constantly at Disney. So you feel like you're in another world, right? And when that illusion gets shattered, then it does kind of brings the experience down a notch, which is something that I think we could think about when we are talking about our choir conversation, which is that we do want to strive to have excellent choirs. That is in my opinion, should be at the forefront of what we do. Because everything that we talk about extraneously then stems from that. We have these excellent choirs, and people are attracted to that, meaning they want to come be in the choir. We do a better job recruiting to get kids in the choir and adults in the choir when the choir is perceived as good. We shouldn't run from that we should be pursuing that. What does it mean to have a good choir so that people will come? And then all of the other social emotional things that we preach about, that, choir's not really about how perfect it is, it's about the human connection. I agree. But the question is, it's not, you can't start with the human connection. You can't go in and into a choir and have a human connection on day one. It doesn't work that way. Humans are scared of each other. We have to open ourselves up gradually over time. And in my experience, the best way to do that is to create musical experiences that cause people to have shared experiences, shared goosebumps, shared eye exchanges back and forth when they realize they just did something amazing. That's what opens the door to all the other things that we talk about wanting to achieve in choir, like being more accepting, being more inclusive, creating a sense of belonging, creating a sense of development of social, emotional type skills that we try to teach in choir. And that I agree that all of those things are really important parts of what we do. What I'm arguing here, though, is that we do those because and only if we can have a good choir. When you have a not good choir, which do exist, I'm sorry, they just do. There are such a thing as choirs that are not good. It's harder for those choirs to recruit. I see questions online all the time, like, what do you do to recruit? And it's hard for me to not answer in a snarky way, because I don't intend it as snarky, but you might have seen some of my responses to those questions. Have a better choir. Like, there is no better recruiting tool than sounding great, because people want to be part of something that they perceive as good. Now, the other part of this elitism, since I am kind of on a rant now about elitism, that the other part of this coin that is important, and I should point out, so make sure everybody understands where I'm coming from with this, is that are there going to be different definitions of what good is, depending on culture, depending on geography, depending on time period, depending on just a multitude of other things? Of course, yes, there are tons of different definitions of what good is, and that's okay. It's okay to have yours, right? And someone else could have theirs. That's fine. But what I'm going to suggest is that you got to have one. You've got to have one. And it could even be a super flexible one, right? That's context dependent. So in other words, my definition of what a good choir sounds like could be dependent upon the context of the choir that I'm standing in front of at that moment. And in fact, it should be, right? So there have been days in my career where I've been standing in front of 14-year-olds that have never sung before, all the way to adult professionals who are being paid to be note perfect on the day that they arrive, and 92-year-old church choir tenors, all in the same day. I've had days like that where I've stood in front of all of those choirs. Is the definition of what I think of as good the same in all of those? No, there are different goals. It depends on what your goals are. And so you could have, as a director, you could have tons of different working definitions within your professional life of what a good choir sounds like. And it can be flexible, context dependent, but you still have to have that as a goal, in my opinion, in order to make progress on yourself as a professional. Right? And that's so important because singers flock to that. So trying to outline and trying to have conversations online about what a good choir is and what a not good choir is, or of course we probably want to avoid online conversations specifically about a choir we think is not good, because that's just mean, right? That's not how we would have that conversation probably, or shouldn't. But we would or should have conversations about things that we think are aspirational about a choir. So which choirs are really good? What are they doing that is really good? What makes them sound good? Okay, so for example, Facebook was blowing up last week about Jason Ferdinand and his new adult professional level ensemble that he put together for the Voces 8 thing. That's awesome. And so what I would be interested in is then taking the conversation to the next level. Why were they so good? What did they do? What were the things that they were doing with their mouth holes, as I like to say, to make it sound amazing? okay, and their bodies with their spiritual connection to each other and to the music. What was Jason doing that made it so amazing? What were the things that he was doing to contribute to that? Because those are the types of things, when we talk about professional development, that's what we need. That is the conversation that we need to be having. And so rather than shying away from the concept that there is such a thing as excellence, right, in the choral world, there of course is. There of course is. And we don't have to talk about one example like I just did and then think of that as taking away from someone else, because it isn't, right? We could have tons of new pieces of pie being baked all the time in the choir world. A new choir like Jason's could spring up, and it could just be like the talk of the town, and then other groups might be amazing again tomorrow and be able to share their art. So that's one form of elitism. The other, you're going to hear in just a second. I was just out on a walk and did kind of an impromptu thinking. After I exercise, I tend to think better, more fluently. And so I'm going to cut you next to some thoughts that I had as I was walking about a different form of elitism in terms of what opinions are allowed to be expressed, and what are the right opinions, and what are the wrong opinions, and how do we have those conversations, especially as it relates to the way academia, in other words, the collegiate level of our profession, interacts with those of us who I would say are in the trenches, right? We work with kids, real live humans every day. So I have some thoughts about that, because I think that there is a conversation to be had there with how the two worlds, I guess you could say, the teaching people how to teach world interacts with the actual teaching of live human children. And that's an important concept as well. So stick around for that. The audio quality for everything that I'm doing this week is a little bit different and not quite as sound as what, no pun intended, as what I do when I'm back home. But I hope this stimulates some thoughts and some thinking there. The audio might be a little bit shoddier than normal for these, because I am out walking home from the gym and don't have a car here, but thought I would go ahead and make some stuff and voice some thoughts, because I tend to think the best right after I exercise. So if you're seeing the video version of this, I apologize for what you see. So my thoughts today are related to something that I've noticed in the academic sphere of late, really over the last 5 years or so, which I would put into the category of a certain type of elitism, maybe some type of gatekeeping that I would describe. It involves the word unexamined. That word tends to have a place in a lot of academic critiques of the education profession. Now, of course, I'm a music teacher, and I work within that realm, and most academic papers that I would read on this topic would be music, but I've noticed it in lots of other fields as well. And what I find to be troubling about that usage is that when you read the papers, the fact that the practice that is being criticized is unexamined usually is simply asserted. In other words, it's not a hypothesis that then the paper goes on to prove or disprove or even evaluate any kind of evidence of the unexamined nature of that practice within education. It's just asserted at the beginning of the paper usually that here is an unexamined practice within education that I will go on and critique, and then the critique happens with just this kind of assumption that we're all supposed to smile and nod, that this practice is in fact unexamined. And what I usually don't find in these papers, which you would think in an academic paper you would expect to find something on the other side of that assertion. So for example, you make a claim that a practice within education is unexamined. One thing I would be interested in reading about is maybe some commentary or research or data collected from people who use that practice as to why they do it. In other words, here's, Phil, whatever the practice is that you don't agree with or you think is troubling or simply unexamined, and so you want to evaluate it and decide whether or not we should still do it in education. Maybe go find some people who still do that thing and ask them, why do you do that thing?
because you might find that there are examinations that occur, which I find that to be just mind-boggling, to be honest, that academics in today's day and age don't think to do that. So back to the elitism point of this ivory tower kind of way of looking at education, is that what I find is oftentimes those critiques are things that you would probably not critique if you were outside of the ivory tower of academia, meaning things that have to get done in a classroom because there is limited amount of time in a day, there are limited resources, and there are limited connections that we can make with kids. There are just real life limitations that only a real teacher would understand. And I do mean a real teacher who actually interacts with kids. So one of the problems I see with the academic connection with education is that oftentimes the people teaching the educators are people who they themselves have had very limited experience actually around real human children, outside of the abstract of theorizing about education. In other words, if you theorize about teaching, that is not the same thing as actually teaching. So what I'm interested in is if other people see this phenomenon happening, if anyone is actually troubled by it, or if this is just something that I'm troubled by because I am troubled by lots of things that are not particularly troubling to other people, which I recognize that sometimes is the case with the way my brain works. But there have been several things, for example, that I could think of as a concrete example of this phenomenon. One would be the teaching of literacy within a classroom, music literacy. Right? I'm big on that. I'm a big focuser on music literacy. And I've seen that philosophy be called unexamined. Of course, in almost every case, by people who have a fraction of the music education experience that I do. So people in academia writing papers and writing critiques and all of this. Maybe they're 24 or whatever. And which I find baffling because a person who's been teaching as long as I have knows how much more diversity and social emotional connection that can occur during a classroom experience, how much more literature from around the world can be explored, how much more diversity of experiences within the classroom, all the things that we preach about. You have time for them so much more when your kids can sight read like beasts, because it doesn't take any time to learn the music, which means then you have time to talk about the history, to talk about the culture, to have conversations about the implications of different aspects of music throughout history and time and how it might have interacted with the people. We have time for those types of things in my classroom because I spend so much energy at the beginning of their experience teaching them to read. Not because it's the only way to learn music, but because that way of learning music fits into the time, the resources, and the experiences that I will then have time to give the kids in the classroom. So it has everything to do with a practical choice. It is not a moral choice that elevates literacy over other forms of learning music. That's not the point. And in my opinion, the people who have spent time in the trenches would recognize that. There's only so much time that we have to be able to communicate with kids and to be able to give them a system to master. They can't master all the systems that exist while they're in my classroom. So I have to choose. I have to make choices, and that means, but when you make choices, you exclude certain things. And that's just the reality. I'm not going to lose sleep over that. But I do want the kids to have as much diversity of experience as I possibly can. So those are my thoughts for the day. And I'm back now. Enjoy your day.